e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, f4, e5, knight b3, bishop e7, f takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8 check, bishop takes d8, bishop g5, knight b d7, a4, h6, bishop h4, knight takes e4, bishop takes d8, knight takes c3, bishop c7, knight d5, bishop d6, knight e3, bishop d3, knight takes g2 check, king d2, knight f4, rook a g1, g6, a5, knight takes d3, c takes d3, b6, rook c1, bishop b7, rook he1, b takes a5, rook c7, bishop g2, knight c5, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, f6, rook c1, bishop h3, rook e7 check, king d8, rook g7, rook c8, d4, e takes d4, bishop b6 check, king e8, rook e1 check, king f8, rook e7, bishop e6, rook a7, g5, bishop takes d4, rook g8, rook ge7, bishop b3, rook eb7, bishop e6, rook takes a6, bishop f7, rook takes f6, rook g7, rook takes h6, rook g6, rook h7, bishop d5, rook bd7, bishop e6, bishop g7 check, king e8, rook a7, rook d8 check, king e3, rook d7, rook a8 check, king e7, rook takes a5, bishop f7, bishop e5, rook e6, rook g7, King f2. Rook c6. Bishop c3. Rook h6. King g3. Rook d7. Rook e5. Check. King f8. Rook g takes g5. Rook d3. Check. King f4. Bishop e6. Rook e2. Rook h4. Check. King e5. Rook d5. Check. King takes e6. Rook takes g5. Bishop f6. Rook g6. Rook d2. Rook e4. Check. King f5. Rook eg4. King e6. Rook e4. Check. King f5. Rook eg4. h4. Rook g2. Rook d8. Check. King f7. Rook d7. Check. King e8. Rook d8. Check. King f7. Rook d7. Check. King e8. Rook b7. Rook h6. Bishop g5. Rook f2. Check. King g4. Rook e6. King h5. Rook f7. Rook b8. Check. King d7. Rook d8. Check. King c6. Rook d4. King c5. Rook a4. Rook b7. Rook a2. King c4. King g4. King b3. Rook a3. Check. King takes b2. Rook e3. Rook b4. Check. King h5. Rook takes e3. Bishop takes e3. King c2.